Evan Mercer pulled the tape tight on his gloves. 90 seconds, he said. I'm going to make you call an ambulance. The lawn at Cedar Hollow went quiet. Plastic forks stopped over paper plates. A child who had just run through the sprinkler also froze, not understanding why the adults had suddenly turned to face the same direction. Evan was 20 years old, tall and broad, shoulders straining under his black training shirt. Behind him, Richard Mercer held a plastic cup against his chest, satisfaction showing as clearly as if his son were about to step into a match whose outcome had already been arranged. Andre Whitaker stood beside the ice chest, still holding a folded napkin in his hand. Naomi was near the sidewalk. She was 17 years old, and she neither called out to her father nor ran toward him. She only watched the way he set the napkin down on the lid of the ice chest, so slowly it seemed as if the threat just spoken had not reached him at all. Naomi had seen that gesture during tense days before. Andre always did one small, tight thing before facing danger, as if he needed to remind his body that he was still the one who set the pace. No one at the party knew that the man in the gray shirt had once lived for years in places where even a small sound could foretell disaster. The neighbors only knew that Andre mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, returned borrowed tools on time, and often brought an extra bag of salt to the house next door before the first snow of the season. They knew he worked as a home security consultant. They did not know why he always chose the seat that could see both the front door and the back. Evan knew even less. 6 years earlier, Andre had brought Naomi to Cedar Hollow on a September afternoon. She was 11 years old then, sitting between two boxes of books in the rented moving truck, hugging a moon-shaped nightlight to her chest. The house they bought was not large. The porch roof needed repainting. The back fence leaned to one side, and the room next to the kitchen was just barely big enough for a desk and 2 filing cabinets. But when Andre opened the door, Naomi ran through every room as though checking whether this place truly belonged to them. She opened the closet, looked into the space under the bed, then stood for a long time in front of her bedroom window. Andre did not ask what she was looking for. He understood the need to be certain a place would still be there after you woke up. For many years, Andre's life had been measured in moves, bags that were never fully unpacked, and calls home that always had to end early. When he left the military at 38, he did not dream of a big house. He only wanted Naomi to be able to leave her books on the table without ever having to ask when they would need to go back into boxes. He wanted to know which floorboard creaked at night, which faucet needed an extra half-turn, and at what angle the October light fell across his daughter's bedroom wall. The early years were not as settled as they appeared. Some nights Andre woke at 3 o'clock at the sound of a branch scraping against the glass. He would stand in the middle of the kitchen, hand gripping the back of a chest, trying to remember that he was in Pennsylvania and not somewhere halfway around the world. Naomi never asked about those nights. She simply began leaving a clean cup beside the coffee maker, as if care could be hidden inside a small act, so the one receiving it would not feel pitied. During the day, Andre ran North Star Risk Group from the room next to the kitchen. On the form he sent to the Homeowners Association, he listed his occupation as independent security consultant. That was true, just not complete. North Star assessed risk for data centers, warehouses, and businesses that needed more protection than a fence and a few cameras could offer. Andre built the company with his savings, old connections, and the principle that people do not prepare for the day everything goes according to plan. At home, he tried to leave work behind the office door. At 6 in the evening, he cooked. At 8, he asked Naomi whether she had filled up the car, even though she always said the tank was still half full. On Sundays, the two of them called Grandma Lena in Philadelphia. She usually asked Andre whether he was getting enough sleep, then didn't wait for an answer. Naomi talked about school, her shifts at the library, and the colleges she was considering. Andre sat and listened, occasionally bending down to tighten a loose screw under the dining table with a coin. Since he could never remember to buy the right screwdriver, Cedar Hollow slowly grew used to them. People knew Andre would help push a car with a dead battery, but wouldn't stay long enough to hear thanks. They knew Naomi remembered the name of every dog on the street and always returned her library books on time. No one asked much about her mother. Andre never explained that his marriage had ended during years when both of them had grown too tired to know who to blame anymore. That peace lasted long enough for Andre to begin believing he had earned it. Then, the three-story house next door was sold. The afternoon, the Mercer family moved in. The sound of the engine rang out before the car even appeared at the bend in the road. Naomi was sitting on the porch steps working on a scholarship essay. Andre stood by the flower bed, one hand holding the hose. The black sports car swept onto the street as if Cedar Hollow were too small to contain its roars, then stopped in front of the house that had sat empty for months. The person who stepped out of the driver's seat did not look their way right away. He walked around to the back of the car, pushed his sunglasses up into his hair, and admired the mansion with the satisfaction of someone reclaiming something that had always belonged to him. Then Evan turned his head, caught sight of Andre standing on the other side of the hedge, and the smile on his face slowly began to change. That smile did not disappear. It only lost its social politeness, revealing a quick, cold assessment. Evan looked at the old shirt Andre was wearing, his dirt-stained shoes, and the length of hose lying at his feet. In his mind, everyone was sorted into a category from the first meeting. People worth impressing, people who could be ignored, people who would back down if pushed close enough. Andre was placed into the last category before the two of them had exchanged a single word. Naomi noticed that look but did not raise her head again. She kept working on her essay, though the tip of her red pen had stayed on one line for too long. Andre shut off the faucet and coiled the hose slowly. He did not like the way Evan was looking over his house. But a glance was not yet reason enough to create conflict. Years earlier, Andre had learned that real danger usually began with details too small for others to think worth remembering. A dark gray SUV appeared behind the first car. Richard Mercer stepped out from the back seat, finishing a phone call while waving at the moving crew with broad, impatient gestures. He wore a white polo shirt, a large-faced watch, and shoes unsuited for standing on grass. Within the first 10 minutes, Richard had asked about the price of the house across the street, complained about the moving crew's pace, and mentioned 3 times that he used to own a bigger place in Connecticut. He only turned to Andre when a wooden crate nearly struck the gate. "You live over there?" Andre nodded. He had met plenty of people who asked the value of what they were looking at before they asked a name. Richard did not wait for a longer answer either. He talked about the 3-acre lot, the pool that was about to be redone, and the plan to replace the entire back fence. His voice was loud enough for Naomi to hear from the porch steps, though she did not want to. When Andre gave his name, Richard repeated it once, as if memorizing someone who might be useful to call for odd jobs. Evan stood leaning against the car door, scrolling his phone while his father talked. He was taller than Richard, with thick shoulders and arms straining under his sleeveless shirt. On the gym bag by his feet was the Summit Combat Academy logo. Andre only glanced at it, but that was enough to see the tape wrapped around the wrists, the fingerless gloves, and the black belt folded so that the name embroidered in silver thread faced outward. By the end of the week, the Mercer family had taken over the rhythm of the whole street. The pool repairman's truck was parked along the curb from early morning. Music from the backyard ran past dinner time. Richard walked the property with his phone pressed to his ear, talking about shipping contracts as though anyone standing nearby needed to know how large they were. Evan often pulled out of the driveway with a hard press of the gas pedal, then returned with his engine echoing through closed windows. Andre did not complain. He drew the office curtains earlier and put a cushion under the door to reduce the vibration. Naomi moved her desk away from the wall facing the Mercer house. Both of them did these things without naming the inconvenience out loud. In their family, adapting had long since become its own private language. 3 days later, Evan hung a punching bag from the oak tree near the boundary between the two properties. He chose the thickest branch, used a steel chain, and hung the bag close enough that whenever it swung hard, the bottom nearly swept across the row of lilac bushes. Andre was drinking coffee on the porch when the first punch landed. Evan trained at the end of each afternoon. He started with movements that were fast, showy, and loud enough to draw attention. Wide hooks sent the bag spinning hard. Spinning kicks made the steel chain grind against the bark. Every so often, he stopped to check Andre's windows, as if making sure the performance had an audience. Andre watched, not out of curiosity. Professional habit made him automatically read other people's movements. Evan had real speed, real power, and thousands of hours of gym training behind him. But his chin tended to lift after a combination. His back heel left the ground too early. Every time he tried to add power, his upper body got ahead of his center of balance. These were not the kind of mistakes that would make a person lose every match. On a flat mat, with clear rules, a referee, and an opponent in the same weight class, Evan could be very hard to beat. What Andre recognized was that Evan had never once had to ask himself what would happen if the ground were slick, the space too tight, or the person in front of him did not react the way he had been trained to expect. Naomi came out onto the porch one afternoon, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She set one down beside her father, then looked over at the swinging bag. Is he good? Andre watched Evan throw a high kick, land off balance by half a step, then immediately reset his stance as if nothing had happened. He believes he's good. Naomi understood that was not a dodge of an answer. Her father had always treated confidence and ability as 2 different things, sometimes standing side by side, sometimes very far apart. She sat down on the porch step, opened her phone, and went back to reading college application instructions. Across the yard, Evan kept adding power until the bag struck the first lilac branch. Richard appeared from the back door with a glass of water in hand. He looked at a few fallen leaves, then over at Andre. Walter laughed. Instead of calling his son to stop, Richard smiled as though he had just witnessed an interesting little test. The following weekend, a brown delivery truck stopped in front of the Mercer house. Its rear wheels crossed barely a hand's width over the edge of the driveway. The moment the older driver stepped down, Evan was already out of the garage, walking straight toward him, while Andre stood by the mailbox at that moment, still holding a stack of unopened bills. The driver looked to be in his 50s, hair gone gray at the temples. He had just pulled wrist of the scanner from his belt when Evan stepped between him and the path up to the porch. There was still enough room to walk around, but the driver did not do so. People who have to pass through dozens of doorways every day tend to recognize very quickly when a small inconvenience is being used to invite them into an argument. "You're parked on my driveway." Evan did not raise his voice. He did not need to when his build, his position, and his stare had already done the rest. The truck's wheel only touched the seam where the public asphalt met the Mercer driveway. The driver looked down, then at the package in his hands, as if hoping the inanimate object could let him finish his job without wounding a stranger's pride. He got back in the cab and moved the truck less than a meter. Evan stayed standing there until the engine cut off a second time. Then he took the package without a thank you, signed with one long stroke, and turned back into the garage. The driver glanced at Andre, just for a moment. There was no plea for help in that look, only the tiredness of a man who knew he had given way not because he was wrong, but because he still had too many addresses left before his shift ended. Andre tightened his grip lightly on the envelopes in his hand. He could have stepped over. He could have said the wheel had not been blocking anything. But at that moment, stepping in would only have given Evan exactly what he was looking for: an opponent and an audience. Andre waited for the delivery truck to leave before opening the mailbox. Inside was an electric bill, some flyers, and a postcard from Grandma Lena. Even though she still called the 2 of them every Sunday, similar incidents began appearing regularly. Evan stood in the middle of the sidewalk when the neighborhood kids rode up on their bikes, forcing them to swerve down onto the edge of the road. He left the trash bins right against the shared poured path and watched other people pull them aside themselves. One day, he revved his engine just as Benjamin Cole was trimming rose bushes near the curb. The noise startled him into dropping his shears, while Evan simply rolled down his window, smiled, and drove off. None of the incidents were large enough to call the police over. None of them, told on their own, sounded serious. That was exactly what made them effective. Evan understood the instincts of decent people. They tended to ask themselves whether they were overreacting before they asked whether the other person was acting on purpose. Diane Parker, the head of the Homeowners Association, sent a general reminder email about noise, parking, and keeping the sidewalks clear. She did not name the Mercer household. Diane had lived in Cedar Hollow for 13 years and believed that gentle wording could keep any conflict at a civil level. Richard read the email in the kitchen, laughed, and forwarded it to Evan with a yawning face emoji. Evan understood his father's message the way he understood everything. No one dared call them out by name. Andre saved the email into a separate folder along with a photo of the bent mailbox latch and a note of the times Evan's car engine usually started up near midnight. He was not building a story out of these details. He was simply keeping them. Experience had taught him that memory shifts with emotion, but timestamps do not. Naomi saw the folder when she brought coffee into the office. On the screen was a simple spreadsheet, just dates, times, locations, and short descriptions. She did not ask Andre what he planned to do. She knew he had no intention of confronting anyone yet. What he was doing was preparing so that if someone ever asked where it had all started, the answer would not depend on whoever spoke the loudest. From then on, Naomi paid closer attention, too. She noticed Evan tended to pick moments when Richard was not nearby to block the younger kids, but trained harder whenever his father was out in the yard. She saw him glance toward his own window after a showy kick, as if every movement needed to be confirmed by someone watching. Sometimes Evan's arrogance irritated her. Other times, she saw in it something close to hunger. Richard did not praise his son the way other fathers did. He never said Evan had worked hard or improved. He only said Evan was stronger than other people. If Evan won, Richard laughed loudly. If he stumbled, Richard immediately found a cause outside his son. The ground wasn't level. The bag was hung at the wrong height. The gloves didn't fit right. Each excuse spared Evan a minute of embarrassment, while also taking away his chance to learn how to sit with it. One evening, Naomi asked her father why he didn't talk to Richard. Andre was washing the cast-iron pan. He let the water run over the layer of oil still clinging to the bottom, watched it thin out, and only then answered, "Because they don't want to solve anything yet." Naomi understood. Some people start a conversation to find a way to live alongside each other. Others only want to know how far they can push before the other side backs down. Evan belonged to the second kind, and Richard had spent his whole life rewarding his son every time he pushed one step further. Andre turned off the tap, dried his hands, and looked out through the window above the sink. Next door, Evan was training under the backyard lights. The punching bag swung, brushing against the lilac bushes. A young branch snapped off, caught in the chain. Evan saw it, but did not free it. He threw another kick, sending green leaves scattering down onto Andre's side of the property. The next morning, Naomi drove her father's old pickup truck out into the middle of the yard to wash it. She rolled down the window, played a familiar song at just a comfortable volume, and pulled the hose around from inside the house. Andre was in his office, headset on, in the middle of a call. Naomi had just bent down to scrub a mud stain on the front wheel when a long shadow fell across the hood. She looked. She looked up. Evan had crossed over the boundary between the two properties. Evan walked slowly toward the driver's side door, his eyes fixed on the speaker still playing music, as though the sound itself were an insult aimed directly at him. Naomi straightened up, the wet sponge still in her hand. She did not step back right away. Andre had once taught her that when there was no clear line of retreat, a hasty step back could sometimes only convince the other person they were allowed to advance further. Turn it down. Evan's voice was calm, almost polite, but he did not wait for Naomi to answer. He leaned in through the open window, reached for the dashboard, and yanked the volume knob hard. The song cut off mid-line. The plastic knob let out a dry cracking sound, then sat in his palm as he pulled his hand back. Naomi looked at the small black object between his fingers. What sent a chill down her spine was not the value of the thing. It was how natural the motion had been. Evan had stepped into a yard that was not his, reached into someone else's car and broken something simply because he believed his own annoyance mattered more than their ownership. "Don't touch my family's car." She said each word clearly. No raised voice, no pleading. Evan turned, seeming surprised that Naomi did not immediately soften. He dropped the knob into the truck bed where it landed beside the coiled hose with a faint clink. Then he took another half step forward, close enough that Naomi had to tilt her head up to look him in the face. "You should learn to respect your neighbors." Naomi caught the thick smell of cologne mixed with sweat from his training session. Behind Evan, the lilac bushes trembled in the wind. Several branch tips already scraped raw by the punching bag. She knew she could scream. Benjamin's window was open, and Diane usually worked in her front room. But Naomi also knew Evan was waiting for a big reaction, waiting to turn her into the one who looked out of control. She set the sponge down, kept both hands in front of her, and stepped back toward the side of the truck, where the open path led straight to the front door. Her phone sat on the folding chair beside the hose. Evan noticed it at the same moment she reached for it, but he did not stop her. He only smiled, a smile that showed he believed she wouldn't dare call anyone. Naomi pressed her father's name. Andre was listening to an engineer present on a vulnerability in the access control system of a warehouse in Ohio when the phone buzzed on the desk. Naomi rarely called when she was only a few meters away. He looked at the screen, pulled off his headset, and was on his feet before she finished her first sentence. Through the office window, Andre saw Evan by the truck. Naomi stood more than an arm's length from him, shoulders held straight but her feet already turned toward the door. The coffee cup on the desk was still warm. The meeting continued on in the headset left behind. Andre did not remember whether he had closed his laptop. He only remembered that he needed to walk. Running would frighten Naomi. Running would also make others see a large man charging toward a young white man. Andre stepped through the front door with both hands open, arms hanging naturally at his sides. He took in Naomi's position, Evan's hands, the windows of the houses across the street, and the small camera under the eaves. The calculations happened fast enough that from the outside he looked like nothing more than a father trying to stay calm. "Go inside, Naomi." She did not argue. As she passed her father, Naomi brushed her hand lightly against his elbow. Not a plea for help, not asking permission either. Just her way of saying she was still okay, even though Andre could feel that her fingertips were colder than usual. Evan watched Naomi until the door closed. Andre stopped almost 2 meters from him, close enough to talk, far enough to avoid being caught off guard by a sudden touch, and wide enough that no one could say he had cornered Evan. "What did you just do to that car?" Evan tilted his head toward the truck bed. The volume knob lay in a streak of soapy water, small enough to seem almost meaningless. He shrugged, as if the smallness of the object erased what he had done. "The music was giving me a headache." Andre could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow. Anger sat deep beneath his chest, but anger was only information. It told him a line had been crossed. It was not allowed to choose how he responded. "You don't step onto my property. You don't touch my car. And you don't approach my daughter the way you just did." Evan let out a short laugh. He took a step forward, testing the distance Andre was holding. Andre did not back away. He also did not raise his hands, tense his shoulders, or lock eyes the way men usually did when challenging each other. He kept his gaze on the bridge of Evan's nose, a point that let him track both shoulders and both hands at once. In Evan's mind, there was no room for this kind of calm to exist. His father would shout. His coach would bark orders. Everyone he had ever intimidated had either over-explained themselves or quickly stepped aside. Andre did neither, leaving Evan unsure whether what was rising in him was confusion or offense. "What are you going to do if I don't listen?" Andre knew Naomi was watching from behind the curtain. He also knew Evan knew it too. "You won't want us to find out." Andre's voice stayed low, with no specific threat for Evan to carry back and repeat to anyone. That was exactly what unsettled him more. Evan stood a few seconds longer, then stepped back with a strained smile. He turned toward his own house, but at the property line he paused, glancing past Andre's shoulder toward the door, where Naomi still stood behind the curtain. That glance lasted only a second, but Naomi understood what Evan wanted her to notice. He had heard Andre's warning. He simply had not yet accepted that it carried any weight. Once Evan had gone back, Naomi left the curtain and picked the volume knob out of the truck bed. A crack ran down the black plastic. She set it on the kitchen table, beside the keys, a piece of evidence too small to explain the feel still lodged in her chest. Andre did not ask his daughter whether she was scared. That question usually forced a person to choose between admitting weakness and pretending nothing had happened. He simply checked the camera, saved the footage in 2 places, then called the auto shop. Naomi sat across from him, picking dried soap off her wrist with a fingernail. She recounted every detail. Andre listened until she finished, without cutting in and without turning his daughter's experience into his own anger. 3 weeks later, Evan won a regional semi-contact sparring tournament. Richard hung a large banner over the gate. Even though the tournament had only taken place in a community college gymnasium 2 counties away, the party started in the afternoon and ran past midnight. Cars lined both sides of the street. Colored lights swept across Naomi's bedroom window, and the music made the glasses in the kitchen cabinet tremble faintly. Richard led Evan from group to group, one hand on his son's shoulder, the other raising the trophy like proof that everything he had ever said about his family was true. Evan talked about the opponents he had beaten, but left out the headgear, the referee, or the contact limits. Each time the story got retold, the punches landed harder, and the wins came against tougher odds. Richard never corrected him. He added a few details of his own, then looked around to make sure others were listening. By the end of the night, Evan had nearly come to believe in the bigger version of himself. In the days that followed, he trained longer under the oak tree. 2 friends from the gym often sat in folding chairs near the pool, watching and filming on their phones. Evan no longer just hit the bag. He moved along the boundary line, throwing kicks close enough to set the lilac leaves trembling. When a branch snapped under a heel, he glanced down at it, then kept going, as if the ground on the other side belonged to no one worth considering. Thursday afternoon, Naomi invited 2 friends over to finish a history presentation. The 3 girls sat around the wooden table in the backyard, surrounded by notebooks and glasses of lemonade. Andre worked in the room next to the kitchen. He heard the steady thud of the punching bag outside, but only looked up when the rhythm changed. The strikes were no longer aimed at the center of the bag. They were drifting toward the trees. Naomi tried to keep reading her notes. Each time a branch snapped, Evan glanced over at the table. His 2 friends behind him laughed quietly, not because anything was actually funny, but because they knew laughter made the act look approved of. Naomi did not want to give Evan another reaction. She had learned that people like him tended to call silence agreement, but call objection troublemaking. When a kick brought down a large lilac branch at the edge of the yard, Naomi texted her father. "He's doing it on purpose to wreck the tree." Andre read the message in the middle of a risks assessment report. He saved the document, took off his glasses, and looked out the back door. Evan stood on the other side of the tree line, sweat soaking through his training shirt. His 2 friends sat behind him, phones still pointed forward. Andre understood they were not merely an audience. They were the reason Evan would find it harder to back down if told to stop. He walked out into the yard, closing the back door so the girls would not have to hear the whole exchange. "Evan, stay away from the trees." The next punch stopped halfway through. Evan turned, breathing hard, then looked toward his friends before looking at Andre. In that moment, what mattered to him was no longer the branch. Andre had just called his name in the voice of someone setting a limit, right in front of the 2 people he needed, to prove he took orders from no one. Evan stepped right up to the boundary line. He said the branches had grown over onto Mercer land, even though the broken one clearly lay on the other side. Andre did not argue over individual leaves. He told Evan to move his training somewhere else and to stop bothering Naomi. "Are you trying to make me look bad?" Evan crossed the boundary line. His right hand grabbed Andre's collar, twisting the fabric into a tight fold under his chin. Naomi shot up from her seat behind the glass door. The 2 friends on the folding chair stopped laughing, but one phone was still recording. Andre's body reacted before his anger could reach his hands. He turned his hips half a step, held Evan's wrist close to his own chest, then redirected the pressure exactly along the line the joint could take without injury. The strength in Evan's arms suddenly counted for nothing. His knees buckled onto the grass, his breath breaking out in a short, startled sound. Andre let go immediately. Evan pushed himself back up, his face flushed red. There was no punch he could point to, no injury to help him switch roles in front of his friends. He had grabbed an older man and, in under a second, ended up on his knees, as though the ground itself had pulled him down. Less than an hour later, a hard knock sounded at the front door. Richard stood on the porch, his face red with anger. Evan behind him, one hand cradling his wrist, avoiding the window where Naomi stood. Richard said he could sue, get Andre fired, and take the house too, if he felt like it. That house was exactly the kind of thing such a threat could cut deep into. According to estimates from the first quarter of 2026, 44% of households, with a reported black householder in the U.S., owned the home they lived in, with a margin of error of 0.9 percentage points. The rate among non-Hispanic white householders was 75%, with a margin of error of 0.4 points. Andre was not thinking about those numbers as Richard spoke. He was thinking about the height marks on the doorframe and the years he had lived without ever daring to fully unpack. But Andre did not hand that memory over to someone looking for something to wound him with. Fourth, you should take Evan home. Richard stood there a moment longer, then turned away, convinced he had just left behind a promise. Evan followed. In his eyes now was the added confusion of someone who had just discovered his own body could be controlled without understanding how. The door closed, and Andre knew the next confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was only a matter of time. That stretch of time lasted exactly 3 weeks. The Mercers did not step over the boundary line again. Evan also stopped training right up against the lilac bushes. But whenever he drove past Naomi, he slowed down just enough for her to notice. Richard stopped greeting Andre at the mailbox and sent out another email about neighborly conduct, still without naming anyone. The neighbors sensed something had happened, though only Benjamin asked Andre whether he needed help fixing the hedge. Andre replaced the broken branches one Sunday morning. Naomi held the bag for the clippings while he trimmed back the damaged wood with the shears he had sharpened the year before. Father and daughter did not talk about Evan. They talked about her essay deadline, about Grandma Lena wanting them to come to Philadelphia for Thanksgiving, and about the check engine light that had come back on in the truck. Ordinary conversations that reminded Naomi the Mercers could not yet take over the whole of their lives. The first weekend of September, Cedar Hollow held its annual block party on the shared lawn at the end of the street. Folding tables were set up in 2 rows. Children ran through the sprinkler while the smell of grilled meat and buttered corn drifted between the open houses. Andre stood by the ice chest talking with Benjamin. Naomi sat near the curb with a few friends, her folder of college applications tucked in a bag under her chair. When Richard's small electric cart appeared, the chatter did not stop right away. It only thinned. Evan walked behind his father, wearing a black training shirt and knee-length compression shorts. 3 people from Summit Combat Academy came with them. He carried a large bag over one shoulder, though no one else had brought training gear to the party. Andre noticed the bag before Evan noticed him. He walked straight across the lawn, set the bag down beside the ice chest, and unzipped it. A pair of sparring gloves came out and landed at Andre's feet. Richard stood a few steps away, cup of water in hand, his expression calm enough that his approval was unmistakable. Finish what we started last time. No one answered. Diane set down her serving tongs. Benjamin took half a step back. Naomi saw Jordan Lee near the drinks table already raising a phone. The small relief of knowing someone was filming was not enough to stop her hands from tightening around the strap of her folder. Andre looked at Evan, at the stretch of lawn behind him, at the children being pulled aside by their parents, and at the phone cameras already turned his way. He understood that walking away might protect him for a few minutes, but Evan would turn it into proof that the threats had worked. He also understood that accepting the fight would turn the whole thing into a different story. one where the line between self-defense and wounded pride disappeared. Andre nudged the gloves off the toe of his shoe. "I'm not fighting you. Pick those up and step back." Evan had not expected that answer. He glanced at his father. Richard tilted his head slightly, a small gesture, but familiar enough for Evan to understand he was being chaffed. The three friends behind him stayed quiet, too. That silence made him feel Andre had just taken away the one thing he'd brought with him to win back his standing. Evan bent down and picked up the gloves, but did not put them away. He pulled them on, tightened the strap with his teeth, then walked out to the middle of the lawn. 90 seconds, he said. "I'm going to make you call an ambulance." The words carried across the yard, clear enough that Jordan angled the phone to keep both Evan and Andre in frame. Richard raised his cup of water, a smile settling at the corner of his mouth. Naomi looked at her father. Andre still stood by the ice chest, hands down at his sides, making no move toward the young man at all. Diane stepped forward and told Evan to stop. Richard told her to stay out of men's business. The comment made several people nearby turn and look at him with visible discomfort. But Richard did not notice. All he saw was his son standing in a place where he could undo the humiliation that had happened by the lilac bushes. Andre took half a step back to widen the distance. "Evan, this is your last chance. Take the gloves off." For a moment, he had a way out. He could have laughed, called the whole thing a joke, walked back to his father's side and kept some of his dignity intact. One of his friends from the gym had even lowered his eyes, as if ready to pretend no one had ever expected a fight. But Richard did not tell him to stop. Evan dropped his shoulders. His back foot slid into position. He did not wait for a bell, did not wait for Andre to raise his hands, and did not let anyone step between them. His full body weight drove forward, the gloves cutting straight across the grass. Andre did not step back. He tilted his head just enough for the left hook to graze past his cheekbone. The skin warmed where the glove brushed by, not yet turning to pain before the right hand came around. Andre raised his forearm to block, a low thud sounding close to his ear. The force pushed his shoulder off by half a step, enough to make Naomi jolt up and send a paper cup falling from someone's hand near the food table. Evan was faster than most people expected. He was not just someone who liked to show off. All those hours in the gym had given him real strength and real reflexes. What he lacked was not in his muscles. It was in his ability to adjust when his opponent did not do what he expected. The third punch was thrown too wide. Andre stepped in at an angle, placed a hand on Evan's upper arm, and turned his shoulder. He did not pull hard. He only redirected a body already moving too fast. Evan swept past him, hip catching an empty folding chair, and had to plant one hand on the ground to keep from falling flat. The chair toppled sideways. No one laughed. The silence itself made Evan's face burn hotter. Richard stood near the electric cart, cup of water still held against his chest. He had expected Andre to raise his arms to guard his face, back toward the ice chest, and give Evan the chance to prove what the two of them had always believed. When that scene did not happen, Richard immediately reached for another explanation. Andre got lucky. Evan tripped on a chair. The grass wasn't even. Quit fooling around. The voice landed on Evan like a familiar order. He got up, raised his gloves higher, and forced himself to smile. But his breathing had already quickened. For the first time since stepping onto the lawn, Evan was not looking at Andre as an older man who needed to be taught a lesson. He was looking at him as a question with no answer yet. "That's enough," Andre said. "Back off." Evan had a second chance. He looked at Richard. What he was searching for was only a nod giving him permission to stop. A word saying that was enough. Richard's jaw tightened. In his world, backing down in front of the neighbors was not wisdom. It was betrayal. Evan began to load his stance. His right shoulder dropped, his hips turned early, his lead foot planted deeper. Andre saw the spinning kick before it fully formed. Naomi did not know the name of the technique, but she noticed the small shift in how her father set his weight onto his back leg. Jordan held the phone with both hands. On the screen, Evan nearly filled the frame. He stepped across, turned his back, and swung his leg. The kick was thrown clean and hard. His heel cut a wide arc that made several people hold their breath. Andre moved into the arc, but the damp grass slowed him by half a beat. The lower part of Evan's shin caught him across the ribs. The impact wasn't loud, but it was enough to knock the breath from Andre's chest and push him back a step. Naomi heard someone call her father's name. Evan felt the contact land, and his confidence returned along with his anger. He spun again, meaning to press the advantage, while Andre had not yet found his balance. But that same kick had already pulled his center of gravity off his standing leg. Andre dropped his shoulder, placed one hand on Evan's chest, and hooked his other leg behind Evan's ankle. He used Evan's own unfinished motion to bring them both down. Evan's feet left the ground. His shoulder and back hit the grass with a heavy thud that made the people standing nearby flinch as one. The breath was forced out of him. Evan lay on his back for a few seconds, eyes wide, mouth working to pull air back in. Andre stood more than an arm's length away, one hand pressed briefly to his own ribs before he let it drop. "Stay down. This is over." Evan heard him, but his eyes went to his father first. Richard was pointing straight at Andre. "Get up." Those two words weighed more than the dull ache running down his back. Evan planted a hand, sat up, then stood too fast. His knees wavered once. One of his gym friends took half a step forward, but stopped when Richard glanced his way. No one wanted to be the one who pulled Evan out and got called the person who made him lose face. Shame narrowed the world around Evan. He did not see the children who had been pulled away, did not see Diane standing in front of an elderly woman, did not see Naomi forcing herself to breathe evenly. He only saw Andre still standing there, gray shirt twisted at the ribs, breathing deeper now, but his eyes unchanged. Evan charged a third time. He abandoned every combination he had trained. Head down, arms spread wide, shoulder driving into Andre's stomach and ribs. The impact sent Andre sliding across the damp grass, his heel carving a short groove. For one moment, Naomi thought her father was about to go down. Evan locked his arms around his hips and tried to lift him, throwing every muscle into one brute pull. Andre dropped his center of gravity. His stance widened, hips sinking back. Evan's lift stalled as if it had struck something driven deep into the ground. Andre wrapped an arm over his shoulder, turned his body, and brought them both down in a direction that avoided the people standing nearby. Evan's knee hit the grass first, then one shoulder was pinned down. Andre did not choke him, did not twist any joint. He used weight and angle to control the upper body, so that every attempt to rise only pushed Evan back down. Evan planted one knee, tore up a clump of damp grass, and nearly got his shoulder up. Andre shifted his weight. Evan collapsed again, breathing so hard the muscles in his back trembled. "Breathe." Evan heard his father shouting at him to keep going. He struggled once more, hand sweeping for something to grab and finding only dirt. Strength drained from his arm faster than his pride would allow. He started to raise his hand to tap out, then stopped, looking toward Richard for a permission that never came. Andre did not add any more pressure. "Tap if you want to stop." Evan's right hand touched the grass once. Hesitant, the second tap was harder. The third had barely sounded before Andre let go and stepped back. Evan lay on his side, coughing lightly, chest rising and falling. No one clapped, no one cheered. In that silence, Richard hurled his cup down onto the grass and walked straight toward Andre, while Naomi was already out of her chair. Naomi stepped forward just as Richard walked past the cup he had thrown down. He did not look at Evan, who was pushing himself up off the ground. He did not ask his son where it hurt. What set Richard off was not the chance that Evan had been hurt, but the fact that so many people had just watched him lose. Andre turned to face him. One side of his ribs still ached dully from the kick, his forearm hot where he had blocked the glove, but his hand stayed open. The distance between them was almost 2 meters. Richard closed it with heavy, unthinking steps. "Stop right there." Andre's voice was not loud. It was low enough that the children near the food table did not flinch, but firm enough to make Richard stop short. For one brief moment, some instinct in him registered what his pride had not yet admitted. The man in front of him had just controlled Evan 3 times without ever losing composure. Richard stopped, then immediately turned that hesitation into reaching for his phone. He called the police in an urgent voice, saying his son had just been attacked by a neighbor in the middle of a family party. Every sentence pushed Andre further from what had actually happened. The refused fight vanished. The gloves thrown down vanished. The 3 times Evan had charged at him on his own vanished too. In Richard's version, Andre had stepped out of the crowd, thrown a young man to the ground, and pinned him until he couldn't breathe. Naomi stood beside her father listening to an afternoon that had just happened, in front of everyone, rewritten in under a minute. She wanted to grab the phone and force Richard to look at what everyone had just witnessed. But Andre reached a hand back and touched his daughter's wrist lightly. The gesture was not asking her to stay quiet. It was a reminder that the truth did not need to shout louder than a lie if something existed to hold on to it. Jordan was still recording. In civics class, Naomi had once read a Pew analysis published in 2025 based on a 2023 survey. 63% of Americans surveyed said videos of police violence made it easier to hold people accountable. 65% of black adults said the wide sharing of such videos was a good thing. At the time, those had just been numbers on a page. Now she understood why a phone sometimes did more than just store an image. It kept anyone from having sole ownership of how a story got told. Evan sat on the grass, pulling off one glove with clumsy hands. He was not looking at Andre. The confusion on his face had turned into a blankness that let Naomi glimpse for a moment the 20-year-old underneath the muscle and the posturing. Evan was waiting for his father to tell him what to feel. Richard was too busy building an enemy to notice his son needed a way out. 2 patrol cars arrived in under 10 minutes. Red and blue lights slid across the white fence and the paper-covered tables. No one at the party was eating anymore, but the food still sat on the grill. The smell of scorching meat began to rise because no one remembered to turn off the flame. Sergeant Elena Ruiz stepped out of the first car. She was in her late 40s, small in build, her eyes never lingering too long on any one person. A younger officer came with her. Richard moved toward them before they had even shut the car doors, launching into the same story in the same confident voice he had used on the phone. Ruiz raised a hand. "We'll talk to everyone separately." She did not let Richard stand beside Evan while taking his statement, nor did she let Andre speak for Naomi. Each person was moved to a different spot on the lawn. The arrangement alone irritated Richard. He was used to his voice being the dominant sound in any room, and this sergeant was splitting the event into pieces he could not control all at once. Andre kept his account brief. He did not mention his military past, did not explain any technique, and did not call Evan a bully. He described the sequence, the challenge, his refusal, Evan's 3 attacks, the 3 times he evaded or restrained him, and releasing him the moment he tapped out. Naomi began from the moment Evan threw down the gloves. When she reached the part where the kick caught her father's ribs, her voice caught. Not because she had forgotten. She remembered too clearly being afraid that others would see only skin color, body size, and the ending of the confrontation, and overlook everything that had led up to it. Benjamin confirmed Evan had been the one to initiate it. Diane admitted she had tried to step in. Finally, Jordan handed the phone to Ruiz. Everyone waited while she watched the video from the start. Evan's voice came through the small speaker, clear across the silent lawn, the threat. Andre's refusal, the first charge, 2 requests to stop. Richard telling his son to get up. The final attack, 3 taps on the grass, and the moment Andre let go immediately. Richard stepped closer, demanding Ruiz's badge number, and saying he knew people who could get her report reviewed. Seeing that Jordan still had the phone, he turned and told him to delete the video before he got himself into trouble. Ruiz closed her notebook. "You just threatened a witness in front of 2 officers. I'd advise you to stop talking." Richard went rigid. She did not cuff him, did not raise her voice, and did not give him a chance to cast himself as the victim. Ruiz stated that the evidence on hand did not show Andre as the one who started it. She would document the threat in full, ask both families to avoid direct contact, and file an official report on the incident. For the first time, Richard looked around the neighborhood and did not see uncertainty. He saw only disappointment, discomfort, and a few eyes that had stopped looking away. He pulled Evan to his feet and walked back toward the electric cart. Passing Andre, Richard slowed his steps. leaning his head in just close enough that the words wouldn't reach Naomi. "I'm going to find out who you really work for." Richard kept his word in the way of someone who always believed the truth was simply something to be rearranged to fit its purpose. Monday morning, he hired a corporate investigation firm in Harrisburg. By Tuesday afternoon, a file sat on his desk on North Star Risk Group, its registered address, its public client list, and its founder's name. Richard read the name Andre Whitaker twice. He was not surprised that Andre ran a company. What bothered him was that no one in Cedar Hollow had ever told him. North Star had no large signage, no television ads, and never showed up at the freight industry parties Richard usually attended. The company operated in the quiet spaces of the economy. A warehouse door that only opened for the right person, a delivery truck that never had its route rerouted, a server that never lost power in the middle of the night, and a disgruntled employee who couldn't get past 3 layers of control with an old badge. None of that drew applause. It only mattered when someone got it wrong. Richard looked at that quiet and mistook it for weakness. He did not know Andre had built the company on the kind of work that did not allow for boasting. North Star's clients did not hire Andre for his military story or his calm demeanor. They hired him because his reports could tell real risk, apart from fear dressed up in expensive language. Wednesday morning, Andre took a call from Daniel Cho while making coffee. Daniel oversaw integrity for a federal procurement program and rarely called before 8. He said Richard had just contacted him, accusing North Star's director of a violent act and demanding the man be removed from any work touching Mercer Continental Freight. Andre set the spoon down beside the sink. "Does he know who I am?" The silence on the other end was answer enough. Richard had made the call believing Andre was just some employee who could be fired if the complaint was loud enough. Only after he threatened to pull his bid did anyone tell him North Star was a security assessment firm, and Andre was its founder. Andre looked out the window. Across the tree line, the curtains of the Mercer home office were still open. Richard was pacing back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. The distance between them was less than 100 meters, but in that moment the two of them stood in entirely different worlds. Richard thought power meant the ability to make someone else face consequences. Andre understood that power, first and foremost, meant knowing when you were not allowed to use it. He asked Daniel to remove his name from the Mercer file immediately. All the assessment work already done had to be handed to an independent team that did not report directly to Andre. Every one of Richard's contacts was logged, but no one was to treat a personal grudge as evidence about the company's competence. Andre had read the federal procurement scorecard released that summer. In fiscal year 2025, small businesses received nearly 28% of the value of prime federal contracts, equal to $179 billion. Including subsumed contracts, the total value reached close to $273 billion. That scale was exactly why any sign of bias had to be kept out of the process, even when the one who stood to benefit from that objectivity was the very person who had just tried to destroy Andre. Over the following 2 weeks, the independent team reviewed Mercer Continental Freight. They did not care about the fight on the lawn. They cared about safety reports filed late, 3 driver complaints missing from the self-disclosure form, and a subcontractor Richard had described as unrelated, despite it still using Mercer warehouses in 2 states. Each detail on its own could be explained away. Placed side by side, they showed a pattern of management that always rewrote the story after the fact. The bigger problem was that Richard had already spent money before winning the contract. He had leased an additional distribution warehouse, ordered a new fleet, and expanded his credit line, believing the bidding round was already a formality. The federal contract was not just a growth opportunity. It had become the foundation under expenses that were now coming due every month. Richard called several more times. First, he demanded to speak with Andre directly. Later, he dropped the names of contacts in the state capital. None of the calls were put through. By the end of the 3rd week, Mercer Continental Freight received notice that it had been dropped from the current review round due to incomplete disclosures and unresolved safety control issues. There was no signature from Andre on it. Not a single line Richard could use as proof of retaliation. That very absence made him angrier still, because it forced him to see his own part in it. Around the same time, Coach Owen Barrett received a video from a parent at Summit Combat Academy. He watched it twice, then pulled up the code of conduct. Every student had to sign to represent the gym. Saturday morning, Evan showed up to train with his hoodie pulled low. Barrett did not humiliate him in front of the class. He brought Evan into his office, set the phone on the desk, and let him watch it himself, 3 times charging forward, 2 requests from Andre to stop, and a hand tapping down on the grass. Evan could not call it edited. Barrett suspended his membership indefinitely, revoked his right to represent Summit at tournaments, and asked him to return the shirt bearing the team patch. Evan peeled the patch off his gym bag himself. The stitching held tighter than he expected. When the last piece of fabric came free, a darker patch of color remained on the bag, in the exact shape of what had just been removed. One of the friends who used to sit behind him texted asking if he was okay, but declined to meet up. The other stayed silent. No one ever came back to the chairs under the oak tree. When Evan got back to Cedar Hollow, Richard stood in the living room, his back to his son, rereading the rejection email on his tablet. Evan started to say something about the gym, then looked at his father's shoulders and stopped. Richard did not ask why the gym bag no longer had its patch either. 2 of them stood apart in the wide room, each waiting for the other to admit fault first. Outside the window, Andre was helping Naomi measure a board for the fence. Richard watched until Andre bent down to pick up the tape measure, then yanked the first curtain shut. He went along the rest of the windows one by one, closing them before dark. Those curtains stayed shut for weeks. Evan no longer trained under the oak tree. The punching bag still hung from its chain, but a thin layer of dust slowly settled over the black leather. The early fall rains added weight to it, so that on windy days the bag only swayed slowly, striking the trunk with a dull, muffled sound. Andre heard the sound from his office. No more punches, no laughter, no phone held up to record. Just an object once used to show off strength, now swinging with no one standing behind it. Richard still went to the office every morning, but his car left later than before. He no longer stopped in the middle of the street to talk on the phone loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The bank asked to revisit the terms of the credit line opened for his expansion plan. A partner who had planned to share a warehouse pulled out of the deal. 2 longtime clients requested a review of his safety records before renewing. Nothing happened in one loud collapse. Richard's business shrank, little by little, like a room kept curtained too long, until the person inside no longer noticed exactly when the light had gone. His relationship with Evan changed too. Before, Richard had used his son's wins as proof his way of raising him was right. Evan had used his father's praise to believe every hot-tempered reaction was strength. After that afternoon on the lawn, both of them had to live with a truth neither wanted to name. Richard blamed Evan for losing. Evan blamed his father for forcing him to keep getting up. Neither said it out loud, because saying it meant admitting the other had never really protected him at all. On this side of the tree line, Andre finished the fence before the first cold snap. Benjamin brought over a cordless drill and stayed to hold the board steady. Diane stopped by with a box of pastries, saying the Homeowners Association had agreed on a new complaint process. She did not apologize with a speech. She only admitted she should have named the problem sooner. Andre took the box, thanked her, and set it on the kitchen table. He did not need the neighbors to become different people. He only hoped that next time, they wouldn't let politeness protect the wrong person. The way people looked at Andre had changed. Greetings became more careful. A few men who used to just nod from a distance now stopped to ask where he'd trained. They spoke in a tone half admiring, half wary, as though the person Andre had been before was only a disguise that had just been peeled away. That did not sit well with him. Andre had lived in Cedar Hollow for 6 years. He had pulled a neighbor's car out of the snow, fixed a lock for the elderly woman at the end of the street, and sat in the hospital with Benjamin when his wife had heart trouble. And yet it took seeing him take down a strong young man for people to start using the word respect. Andre did not blame them entirely. But he did not forget the feeling either. Naomi noticed her father spent less time out on the porch. She did not ask right away. She waited until Sunday evening, while the two of them were eating soup and going back over the college list. On the table sat 4 folders, 3 highlighters, and an envelope from Philadelphia that Grandma Lena had covered in far too many stamps. "You don't like that they're afraid of you." Andre set his spoon down. Naomi wasn't asking. She was stating what she had observed. He looked at his daughter. Realizing she had grown up during years he had spent trying so hard to give her an ordinary childhood. She understood things he had never wanted her to have to understand. "I wanted them to know who I was before that day." Naomi pulled her folder closer and circled a line in her essay with her pen. At the top of the page, she wrote, "A place that belongs to you is not only a place someone else lets you stay in." In early November, a for sale sign appeared in front of the Mercer mansion. It went up early in the morning, before the school bus came through. No one in the neighborhood brought it up in the shared email thread. Moves like this usually stirred curiosity. But this time, the silence felt like an agreement that no one needed to dig any deeper. Richard was not selling because he had nothing left. He needed to free up cash tied up in a house bought, back when he believed the company was about to grow to a national scale. Moving was a way to ease the financial pressure, but it was also an escape from a street where every greeting reminded him of a story he no longer controlled. The moving truck arrived on a cold morning. Evan carried the small boxes out himself. He looked a little thinner, or maybe it was just that he no longer wore the shirts chosen to make his shoulders look wider. Passing the oak tree, he stopped to take down the punching bag. The chain had jammed, forcing him to stand on a ladder and struggle with it for nearly 10 minutes. No friends around. Richard did not come out to help either. Andre stood on the porch with his coffee. As Evan carried the bag past the lilac bushes, the two of them saw each other. Evan did not apologize. Andre did not expect him to. He only glanced down at the new branches that had grown back from where the tree had broken, then kept walking toward the truck. Richard left last. He did not look toward the Whitaker house. The gray car rolled down the street, following the moving truck until both disappeared behind the maple trees. Andre stayed out on the porch a long while. The oak tree at the boundary looked emptier now, with no chain wrapped around its branch. The pain in his side, where Evan's kick had once landed, had faded weeks ago. What remained was not in his body. It was in how Andre now understood that peace was not a gift handed over once and kept forever. Sometimes it needed protecting, but how you protected it mattered just as much as the thing itself. From inside, Naomi called for her father to come look over her essay one last time. Andre set his coffee cup down on the railing. Before turning to go in, he bent down and picked up a lilac leaf the wind had blown onto the steps, held it in his palm, and stepped through the open door. Naomi had spread the pages across nearly half the table. She pulled out the chair beside her for her father, set a finger on the first line, and waited for him to begin reading. Andre sat down beside his daughter. He read each line slowly, pausing at the places Naomi had marked in red pen and staying long enough for her to know she had never had to protect that house alone. Perhaps real strength does not lie in making others afraid. It lies in the ability to stay calm when pride is tested. Tupalter's test. To protect the people you love without becoming the very thing you're standing against. And to be clear-headed enough that consequences find their way back to whoever created them. Andre did not win simply because he was stronger than Evan. He won because he knew when to step back, when to hold his ground, and when not to let anger decide for him. Evan had many chances to stop. Richard had many chances to admit he was wrong. It was the choices they kept making that led both of them to where they ended up. And you? How do you feel about the way Andre handled it all? Have you ever watched someone treat another person's kindness or silence as a sign of weakness? Share your feelings, your own story, or a friend's experience in the comments. What you share might help someone realize they're not alone. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. See you in the next one.